Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of From the Ground Up, a University of Chicago public policy podcast produced here at the Harris School of Public Policy. Today, we have an amazing guest with us whose book, The War Below Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, has created a literal buzz in the minerals and metals industry. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into the conversation. Have a good time. So let's dive right in. We have with us Mr. Ernest today with us. Sir, would you please love to introduce yourself to the audience and give us a context about your background so that the listeners are aware about the background and they know very well who we're speaking to?
Well, it's great to be with you, and thanks for your time. My name is Ernest Scheyder. I'm the author of The War Below Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And the book really builds off of my work at Reuters the past 5 or 6 years covering the critical minerals space. And I really became curious around this question of choice as I was reporting for Reuters about the opposition and support for many critical minerals projects across the United States and really the world. And this idea of choice, I think, is so important as the energy transition accelerates. Where are the places that we as Americans, we as citizens of the world, are comfortable getting lithium and copper and nickel and cobalt and other critical minerals that power devices that help fight climate change, as well as everyday electronics like cell phones and laptops? And the more I reported on these areas for Reuters, the more I realized that people are not having that choice. They're just sort of expecting to show up to a store and have all these products be there. But everything now is going increasingly electronic. And if the world is getting warmer because of climate change, then we have to be thinking about where we're going to get the building blocks for things to fight climate change. So that really inspired me to take a deep dive, if you'll forgive the pun, and write The War Below, because I really wanted to bring to the audience this central idea of choice that I think is so crucial as this energy transition takes off.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And while we were reading the books, and we have been recently recording a few episodes ourselves on rare earths and the global supply chain. So when we were doing that, we got to realize that there are so many critical usage of rare earths, including, like you said, in the laptop space, in the electronic space, including in the green energy space. Solar panels is also using rare earths. Do you think in your research or among your very many discussions that you have had with the stakeholders, do you think are they really aware of what actually is going into these products that they are using every day and the repercussions that the mining of these materials may have on the society in general or the population in general or where the materials is being sourced from?
Time and time again, I found during the course of my daily reporting as well as research for the book that the average consumer does not fully realize just the sheer complexities of the supply chains that goes into producing the building blocks for these critical minerals for these electronic devices. And I just think in general, consumers, especially in the United States, don't often think through supply chains. Supply chain sounds like sort of a boring, staid topic. But remember, it was only 4 years ago this month that the pandemic started, and we really became, at least in the United States, aware of the fact that there were no masks built in the United States. And this is sort of the most basic yet essential piece of medical equipment. And a lot of Americans are sort of shocked to learn that no masks were made in the United States. Now, that's just one basic piece of medical equipment. If you look across the entire electronics manufacturing supply chain, I think people would be shocked to know that the lithium in their cell phone battery probably came out of northern Chile or Western Australia, that the copper probably came out of Peru and was processed and refined in China, that the nickel could have at some point come out of Russia or some other nickel rich place like Indonesia in the world. And these really, really long supply chains, of course, can be interrupted by any number of things, including conflicts or weather. And they also require large shipping. You obviously have to ship these things. And so that increases greenhouse gas emissions, therein exposing the paradox of using these devices to power climate change reduction technologies. So I just wanted to really highlight that for the reader here with the book, because I, and time again, realized people aren't thinking through how long these supply chains are currently.
That's a excellent point. We would love to explore the utility versus the not in my backyard concept of the rare earth, but I think let's circle back to it later because we are talking about
Sure.
the supply chain and global supply chain. we all know that China as a country is a dominant player, right, in these with these minerals and in the entire supply chain. I was reading something earlier, and I found out that China has not only invested in its own territory, but also in territories like Congo and
Yes.
in many other African countries and Southern American countries. So when you, because I understand that you must have spoken to like, I mean, tremendous amount of experts when you were writing your book, and you must be having the daily interaction with them. How are they viewing China's role in their dominance in the global supply chain? And how are the countries tackling it? Because what we found out is countries are increasingly gaining, or at least trying to gain, or trying to make strategic alliances to actually combat that dominance. I just wanted to know your perspective on it, and how are the global leaders thinking? Because we have you, who's who's an expert in this field and who has access to such amazing networks. So please, over to you.
Yeah, so China has been very open with its 5-year plan that it updates, as the name implies, every 5 years. And this is a document that you or I could find right now. So it is not shying away. It is not a secret document. Belt and Road is part of Beijing's attempt to really expand its economic influence across the world. This is not a secret. China's been very open about this, and investments in countries like Argentina or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which have large supplies of lithium and cobalt, respectively, are part of that international economic expansion that China's been very open about. One of the things I chronicle in the book, In the War Below, is how a Chinese company bought into one of the largest cobalt and copper deposits in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, when unfortunately an American company, saddled by debt due to errors from previous corporate leadership, had to sell this asset for roughly about $2 billion, which sounds like a lot of money because it is. But in contrast to the sheer supply of cobalt, which is so essential for the energy transition, you can make the argument that it actually was a steal. And so this was a huge investment by China into the DRC. And I do chronicle in the book how that actually worked out poorly for citizens of the DRC, because the American company was a very responsible steward of the operations there and took very good care of not only its employees, but the surrounding community. It saw it as part of its social license to operate. And now we're starting to see things like artisanal mining really, really proliferate in the DRC, despite the sort of fuzzy sounding name. It's basically average citizens, including sometimes children as young as 6 or 7, going onto mine sites or near mine sites and literally taking pickaxe and shovel and digging into the ground and then selling that rock into a network that gets processed. And so it's really hard to have traceability there. And so that has really proliferated under the current ownership. That's part of one of the chapters in the book that I unpack. And this is definitely a global race for these minerals. I mean, whoever controls lithium and copper and cobalt and nickel and other critical minerals will control the 21st century the way that control of crude oil defined the 20th century. And a lot of companies, excuse me, a lot of countries across the world recognize that this is a tussle. This is a fight for these supplies. And I think you're starting to see governments across the world look at ways to support their own domestic or allied partnerships. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States was a great way, or a great effort by Washington, to boost not only domestic production of critical minerals, but also in allied countries, countries that have free trade agreements with the United States. But there's some perhaps strategic holes in that plan. For instance, only one country on the African continent has a US free trade deal, and that's Morocco. That's not Zambia, that's not the DRC, that's not other copper or cobalt rich countries on the African continent. Argentina, which we were discussing earlier, does not have a US free trade deal. So, depending on who you talk to, there's arguments about whether or not the lithium extracted from Argentina would be compliant with the IRA. And so, countries like Chile and Australia, huge critical minerals producers, do have free trade deals, and they also do large business with China. So there's some countries that do overlap there. But what we are starting to see, and I do talk about this in the book, is, I would say, sort of a bifurcation into two camps globally around where certain critical minerals go. Because at the end of the day, one of the main carrots of the IRA is tax credits for consumers for electric vehicles that are built with a certain percentage of critical minerals extracted from the United States or from countries with US free trade deals. And that's a huge boon, as you would imagine. And electric vehicles are already priced higher than internal combustion engines. So if you can get a tax credit on top of that, manufacturers are obviously going to be behooven to extract those from places like they could get the tax credit and extend that on to their customer. So you can just imagine that that sets up sort of a dual structure that further reinforces this bifurcation.
Thank you so much on that. Honest, there are like many tangents that are coming to my head. So basically, like you mentioned, a US company going bankrupt and a Chinese company actually thriving
It
in
didn't go bankrupt. It just
okay.
it almost did. Yeah, it had a
It
lot of
almost
debt.
did. All right.
Yeah.
All right. My bad. But the Chinese companies, when they are operating in in such regions, the question is, do you think that because the general perception or us as a student of what how who does not have much exposure to the practical realities of that world as of now, how I would think is there's definitely immense amount of government backing for these Chinese companies operating in those regions, strategic support, financial support, and the likes, because how the government is viewing their interest is intrinsically tied to these companies. Is that the case? And B, is the same case also being translated with the US companies in particular? Is the government giving them adequate amount of support that they need?
Yeah, I mean, the way that governments in, say, China versus the United States approach economics, of course, gets at sort of the core tension of a command control economy versus a free market economy. And I think therein lies the rub that companies based in China certainly are in a command control economic situation that differs from a free market economy in the United States. And so that has a lot of different ramifications. We could talk for hours about that. But I think on a practical level, I mean, certainly China has signaled that it is going to use its critical minerals prowess as economic weapons, as levers in the global economy. We saw just a few months ago, China said it wouldn't export rare earth technology anymore.
Yes.
It also would limit the export of certain very minor but very critical minerals, germanium and gallium. Did some rattling, excuse me, around graphite as well. And it's done it in the past to other countries for things like rare earths that are crucial to make magnets. So, I mean, it's been very open about this. Meanwhile, the United States, obviously, the government itself does not control mining companies. It can help with the IRA or the BIL, bipartisan infrastructure law, or other measures to prod industry growth. But it's a different process. It's just completely night and day, and so that is a reality. I mean, in the United States, it does tend to be a messier, longer process to get a mining permit. It can take a decade or longer. 2 or 3 chapters in the book explore proposed projects in the United States, especially that have been on the drawing board for more than a decade and have no end in sight for when they could get permits. And those are for projects that would supply crucial cobalt and nickel and copper to the American and the global economy. In China, it's a much more streamlined process to get approval. And I do talk about the world's largest rare earths mine, which is in China, which is this massive deposit intermingled with iron ore that has a waste pond that's bigger than Central Park in New York City. That would never fly in the United States. So obviously there's different approaches to ESG government as well that sort of lays bare the differences there. And that has ramifications down to just the supply chain, right? I mean, you can produce metals faster in mainland China than you can in the United States from initial ideation for a project to first production. That's just a reality. And like I was mentioning, so China obviously uses its companies to then look across the world and extend its influence. And like a great example is cobalt. Like there is a huge, as we were discussing, huge production in the DRC, and China has a company there called CMOC that's actually increased cobalt production, even though right now the whole world is awash in cobalt. Now, what has that done? That has further pushed down prices. And last year, about 9 or 10 months ago, a US cobalt project that was under development, the company that was developing it just said, we can't do this. They threw in the towel and they mothballed the project because prices were way too low. And I think that is another way that you're starting to see some differentiation between the two approaches, because for a lot of Western companies, they're really sensitive to price. Obviously, it makes sense, but not all the time. Chinese companies are not all the time sensitive to price. It can be market control. And in some ways, we're seeing parallels to that with, for instance, OPEC, which is sometimes some of its members will sacrifice price in order to maintain or grow market share. So that's an interesting parallel there.
The second question was, I just wanted to understand if, so for instance, US has got a lot of regulations which is ensuring certain kind of products with certain certifications reaching the US, and they are mindful of where the material is being procured from. However, the incentives for the countries or the companies, let's say, who are procuring these materials, in my opinion, at least what I feel is relatively a bit limited, because there is other open market who are ready to overlook the procurement problems that are associated with mining.
Right. I mean, I think this gets down to back to the core idea of the book, which is choice. I mean, are we as consumers going to be okay with products that are built at low ESG standards? Or if we know that the metals that were used to make the products we built were mined out of the ground for somebody making the equivalent of a dollar, $1 or less per day, are we going to be comfortable knowing that the lithium might come out of the ground in a very water sensitive region, and so farmers are not able to get enough water for their crops, things like this. I mean, it all gets back to what we as consumers want and what we're willing to demand from our manufacturers, especially as the energy transition accelerates. I mean, one of the main selling points for electric vehicles, for instance, is that you're not emitting any harmful pollutants that could contribute to the climate change effects. But if the metals inside that electric vehicle were used, excuse me, were produced at extremely crappy standards, are we going to be comfortable with that? Or are we just going to let price be the determining factor, regardless of how those metals are produced? And this is so much more than just transportation. And I really focused on this a lot in the book because I really think too often consumers are like, oh, I don't have an electric car. I don't care about this. But I have a whole chapter on leaf blowers, which sounds whimsy and silly, but I did it on purpose because I wanted to take sort of a very common household appliance that increasingly is going electric and really bring to the reader the idea of, okay, well, where do the metals come from? You know, if two-stroke engines for leaf blowers are bad and they're getting banned by governments across the world, and if electric leaf blowers are kind of the way forward here, well, where do the cobalt and nickel and copper come from inside that battery? And I actually, as part of the reporting for the book, tried to figure out where all the metals came from inside this leaf blower that I bought for my backyard. And I got to tell you, I got a lot of resources at my disposal, and I couldn't figure it out at all. And I tried. And that's just for a basic leaf blower. And then you just magnify that across all of the millions of electronic devices that are throughout the world, including cell phones and laptops, which are ubiquitous, but as well as, televisions or many, many other things that we use. And then you just have to realize, gosh, this supply chains really, really matter. And it gets back to the idea of choice. Okay, well, everything is increasingly going electric. Am I comfortable as a consumer knowing that the nickel that goes inside my cell phone's battery could have come from a mine in Indonesia that was created by tearing up dense rainforests and basically destroying this giant carbon sink, and therefore, ironically, making climate change worse? It gets back to what we as consumers are willing to actually tolerate.
I want to jump in here. What you didn't mention there was that when I was reading the book, it was surprising that a leaf blower, a gas powered leaf blower, actually emits more emissions than I believe you referred to a Ford F 150 pickup
Yes.
truck. And I was like, wow.
Wow.
I'm just thinking about that leaf blower around back, and I'm like, I should probably get me one of those Milwaukees. On the other hand, to your point, it's hard to trace the minerals that came together to build that specific Milwaukee leaf blower. And so, but outside of these like basic consumer technologies, it's also, for energy production or for the energy production for the industries that have to extract these minerals. So we want them to do this sustainably, but still they have to go through the same process. For example, I'm the CEO of TechChange Unbrokered, which was started here at the University of Chicago, and we're aiming to solve this problem exactly. And we're participating in a Web3 innovation lab utilizing blockchain
Oh,
to try to
nice.
trace back these minerals. And I was speaking with the solar company yesterday afternoon, and we're in talks right now, not to say too much, but I got to learn their supply chain, and then they were having some concerns about the tax credits that they could leverage here in the United States, but where they get the minerals for the building materials for their solar panels matters to them downstream, even though what they're doing is actually building these mega solar farms. But they can't pass on those tax credits because of certain minerals that are used from where they source these things, and it's not completely transparent to them. So I think to answer Karan's earlier question, yes, industries downstream do feel the impact of where those building materials are sourced. And no, in my opinion, tax credits are not enough for these other industries downstream to leverage and to pass on to consumers. So we want to be mindful of that. You know, we talk about the consumers, we talk about the mining, but we don't talk about, or there is chapters where you mention the energy production, but also when we were talking about China and we were talking about Africa and these other projects, your book covers a lot about projects here in the United States, in
Yeah.
California, in the Midwest, in Minnesota. We actually just attended the Better in Our Backyard winter dinner. So I got to meet folks, talk to folks, Twin Metals, Talon Metals, who you do and you have spoken with. You and I have mutual contacts in the industry, and we share those. But what is going on? What do you think for public policy perspective? If tax credits are not enough, what is going to be the next? And the IRA, in my opinion, is a starting point, but it's not enough. Based
Yeah.
off of your research, based off of everything you've done for the book, writing the book, and what you've learned, what policies do you think are applicable that we could implement now or that we could start developing now to support our industry so that we're mindful of the entire supply chain and not just dependent on the price, on these tax credits, on these monetary things?
Well, first off, I love the blockchain idea. So let's put a pin in that. Maybe you and I can talk in the coming days or weeks. That sounds fascinating. For the book For the War Below, I purposely focused most of the chapters on projects in the United States. That was a strategic choice as the author because I wanted American audiences especially to grapple with where, how, and why they get the building blocks for their everyday lives. I think for too long Americans especially have been used to exporting the procurement of items that they use every single day. And I think that the coronavirus pandemic taught us all, especially the mask example I was talking about earlier, that situation, that dynamic is not sustainable in the long run. And so I wanted Americans to grapple with literally the dirty of mining. Mining is loud, it's intrusive. You literally dig a hole in the ground. There's no way around that, but mines are essential. And the tension points that I keep seeing when I was reporting for my day job across the United States is like, yes, we want critical minerals, but just no, not here. In a previous life, before I covered critical minerals, I covered oil and gas, and I covered the fracking revolution for about 7 or 8 years. Fascinating space. I actually lived in North Dakota for a time, writing about fracking there. And I think a lot of Americans and perhaps people across the world are very comfortable coming into one or two camps with a reaction to oil and gas. Usually it's like, yes, we need it, or no, gosh, oil companies are evil and destroying the earth. With critical minerals, I found 98, 99% of people I talk to say, yes, we need the critical minerals. There's a broad agreement there. It's just the debate is around where you actually get them. And so when I read the book, was writing the book, I said, okay, we have to focus here. And I do focus on projects elsewhere. I have a chapter where I go to Bolivia, and a few other places internationally. But I really wanted the United States, especially, to grapple with this. One of the ways they are trying to boost the what that Washington is trying to boost domestic production, as you said, Christian, is around tax credits. But there are other policy things that I ran into time and time again that were sort of on the wish list, not only from industry, but also their opponents. The law that governs mining in the United States has been around since 1872. And it's been changed a little bit, but not a lot. And it was actually written to encourage development of then what was a pretty uninhabited place, the Western United States. There really wasn't that many people out there. The US had just finished this big war that had really obviously torn through the fabric of the social conscious of the United States. They really wanted to expand further. They went west. A lot of people went west, and we got a lot of expansion there. Part of the benefit of that law is that if you develop a mine on US federal land, you don't have to pay royalties to the federal government. You don't have to pay royalties to taxpayers, i.e., all of us here. And so that's a huge benefit. And so a lot of conservationists would say, well, maybe we should talk about some kind of mining royalty. And I should say that the mining industry itself is open to that. Of course, the devil is in the details, as it were. And so, we'll see how that actually gets ironed out. Another thing is around permitting. I mean, let's just say this, Christian. Let's just say you own 1,000 acres in northern Nevada, and you're convinced that there is a mother lode of lithium there. How do you start the permitting process?
One,
Who do
you
you
got
talk to?
You got to talk to the communities first, the stakeholders, and then you got to go through your local government, maybe your state government. But first, you have to get the buy-in from the communities that surrounds it. And you mentioned a lot. Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. So definitely, yeah, were I advising a mining company, I would say, yes, talk to the neighbors first. But in terms of the federal permitting process, it's a bit of a minefield. It's just very, very confusing. Like, which agency do you need to talk to? Is it Fish and Wildlife? Is it another part of the Department of the Interior? Do you talk to maybe the Energy Department if you want to get loans? Like, there are all these things. And then oftentimes you can have one department in the US federal government moving forward a project that another part of the US federal government is actually holding back. And I have multiple examples in the war below of projects that had moved forward on the financing side of things from the US federal government, but were being slowed down on the permitting side of things due to various roadblocks. And so, having a whole of government approach, that term itself sounds like industry jargon, but it is something that I ran into time and time again reporting for the book. It's like one arm of the federal government did not necessarily or seem to know what the other part of the federal government is doing. And so having sort of a unified approach there was something that mining companies and conservationists alike constantly were bringing up to me. I mean, I mentioned 2 or 3 projects in the book that have been on the drawing board for more than a decade. I mean, it's very unclear now, how do you get to a yes or a no? So the process can sort of be stuck in limbo.
That's an interesting thing you mentioned. I just put it in the chat. So for listeners here, and if you're new here, I'm an alum of the Colorado School of Mines. Go ore diggers. So a lot of this I understand. There's different permitting agencies, but one thing I remember studying back when I was at mines, and I came to the same conclusion. But then I look back and I learned that there actually used to be an organization that used to have this all-encompassing role, if you will, and that was the Bureau of Mines.
Mhm.
Something interesting about it is it was more or less diminished or dissolved almost entirely. Technically, it still exists, but it's almost like a do nothing agency now. And I think that would solve a lot of problems if we had all of those things in one place to go to one agency to do all those things, centralization, if you will, here. So it's something that I think we could do, as there was an agency that existed. But during that time period, there was also, it was in the early 90s. And so there was a surplus, and then there was a change from the Bush to the Clinton administration. And then there was a change in priorities, which I thought was peculiar. At the same time of the closure, if you look at what was going on at the time, that explains why the Bureau of Mines was dissolved. And I believe it was more political and a shift in priorities than it was for industry or practical.
Yeah, it was part of the huge budget cuts that came in the mid '90s, and
Right.
and it was just an easy thing to cross off the list and say, okay, we've saved X dollars without sort of thinking through the long-term implications. But I think when you remember the context of where mining was in the United States at that time, it was not seen as sort of core or essential. And what did we have pass right before that? There was NAFTA. There was a huge focus on globalization. There was really a sense that, okay, well, can we export the production of not only the goods, but the extraction of the metals needed to build those goods? And that was a huge push, not only by Washington, but I think in governments across the world. And what you're starting to see now, especially after the pandemic, is maybe, I don't know if I'd use the word isolationist, but we're definitely starting to see a more regionalization across the world. The European Union certainly is doing this. And I think across North America, you're seeing efforts to really try to improve or bolster regional manufacturing and regional production of the building blocks that are used in manufacturing plants. We'll see how that plays out. I think is going to be interesting things to cover in my job, and certainly from your podcast perspective. And maybe we'll, reconvene in 18 months and swap notes.
For sure, for sure. Hugo, did you have anything to say?
Yeah, in the chapter where you mentioned about the supply chain of the machine you purchase, you mentioned about that European Union can have the, requirement of the company showing the ethical supply chain to the customer, where in the US we don't have that. How the European Union do that, and is this something possible that we can do in America?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Hugo. You're referring to the EU Mineral Passport, which is a way to improve transparency for supply chains that the European Union has really put forward. The United States does not have something similar now. It may in the future. I have a theory, and I explore it in the book, that increasingly consumers are going to want this information in the United States, especially when they go to, say, like a car lot. Like, what's the main metric you look at if you buy an internal combustion engine? Most of the time, it's miles per gallon. because you want to know that, depending on your pocketbook, you're not buying a gas guzzler. I think increasingly consumers are, while they do want to know range on an EV, they're also going to want to know, okay, if I'm buying a vehicle that doesn't
Yeah.
spew out emissions, that I'm doing my part for the environment,
Yeah.
where did all these metals come from inside the electric vehicle? And you're starting to see some automakers respond to that impetus. Like, for instance, Volkswagen is very, very sensitive to how lithium is produced in Chile, which is one of the largest lithium producing countries on the planet. Northern Chile, there's this thing called the Atacama Desert, that underneath the desert lies this giant brine reserve that companies Albemarle and SQM take out of the ground, and they've used giant evaporation ponds to produce lithium there. And so they're very sensitive to know that if they buy lithium from there, that they're not going to basically be replicating the same mistakes and in 50 years be like, oh gosh, like we're just contributing to another ecological situation that like climate change. And so you're starting to see a lot of automakers and other manufacturers respond to this. And I explore in the book the history of IRMA, which is this certification program known as the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And it was actually started by, of all companies, Tiffany, the jewelry company. And you can imagine, obviously, if you own a jewelry company or control a jewelry company, you want to know that the gold and the platinum and the silver that you use to make your engagement rings that you sell to people isn't produced at horrible or atrocious conditions. But I chronicle how Mike Kowalski, who was the CEO of Tiffany for more than a decade, realized that he wasn't a miner, so he didn't know how to help institute responsible mining practices. And he got together with several NGOs, and they created this IRMA organization that took more than a decade really to get under its feet, because it had a very aggressive target of putting together not only the mining industry, but conservation groups that can oppose them, labor unions, indigenous groups, local NGOs, investors, policymakers, and others in the same room, and basically duking it out and saying, okay, what are the best standards for a mine? If we need mines for the future, and we do, then what are the best standards for mining so that consumers and everyone else can be comfortable knowing that the metals produced at these sites were ethically sourced, the people were paid a living wage, they're not destroying local water aquifers, they're not contributing to giant waste pollution pits. And so IRMA is actually really growing in earnest right now as we speak. Albemarle, the world's largest lithium company, had its facilities in northern Chile certified by IRMA last year, which is a huge point of transparency for the global lithium industry, because you and I can go on a website right now and we can load the whole report that IRMA filed from its visit to that site, and we can get under the hood, if you'll forgive the pun, for what actually is going on at that site. And IRMA basically ranks this site and other sites that are IRMA certified on publicly available metrics. And the idea is to boost transparency. It's not necessarily to pass or fail a mine, but it's to bring to the consumer, like you, like me, an idea of how the lithium is produced at that site, how they're holding up against certain metrics, and also to give a carrot for the company to do better, to basically improve how it interacts with its local host community, how it pays its people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so increasingly, I think consumers are going to want to know all of this information as they make a purchase decision, especially given the promise of all these electronic devices to be able to to fight climate change. They're going to want to know that it actually is fighting climate change, and that they actually are contributing to a better planet. And so that chapter for me was essential to include in the book, because I wanted folks to grapple with the idea of what is good mining. I mean, we can't just say mining bad, everything else good, because so much of what we touch every day comes out of the ground. And so we have to be talking about where, how, and why we get these things. And IRMA, for my estimation, and why I included it in the book, was a really interesting way to move that ball forward.
Yeah, yeah. So your theory is kind of like the pressure gonna come from us, the customer, and then eventually there might be something more centralized, like IRMA, where it would bring more diverse group of people doing a more centralized decisions.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily centralized. I would say it actually is meant to be decentralized. By increasing transparency, you're not putting any power in one group or one people. You're actually saying to the whole world, like, hey, here's how this mine stacks up against metrics that all of these groups of people that form IRMA have basically said are the best ways to mine. And it doesn't really sound, Hugo, like all of these groups would actually get along. Like labor unions in the same room as mining companies, or like policymakers in the same room as conservationists. Like, it sounds sort of like a motley crew, right? But they actually did succeed, and they formed these standards that are out there. And Albemarle and other companies are increasingly realizing that it's part of their social license to operate to basically let people look under the hood and share what actually happens at their mine site and how their operations stack up. And Albemarle's operations in northern Chile are evaporative. They're large evaporation ponds. It's a lot different than an open pit mine. So the standards are different depending on what kind of operation you have. And IRMA hopes to grow beyond just mining into processing, for instance, which is a huge other area, obviously, that's extremely important. And so the more transparency you bring to these supply chains, the better. And that's why for The War Below, I really wanted to bring this to the reader because it was such a crucial part. And I think for too long, folks have just, had a sort of a confusingness, if you allow me to make up a word, about the critical mineral space and around mining in general. And I really wanted to bring to the reader a little bit of transparency and light to this area, because it's a book written for everyone, because these are topics that affect all of us.
So throughout this podcast, we focus mostly on mining, and we've gone global with it. We've come back around to the United States, but I want to kind of shift into the latter part of your book, which is closer towards the end. In these chapters, you talk about recycling, particularly towards lithium and batteries. So I'd like you to explain that and what role that actually plays as an alternative and then looking out ahead on the horizon.
Yeah, it was really important for me to have a core part of the book focus on recycling. And I started to get a lot of questions when I was initially ideating the book from people that would be like, okay, well, why do we need more mines? Can't we just recycle in order to get there? And that's sort of the concept of what's known as a circular economy, this idea that we can take old cell phones or old electric vehicle batteries and put them in a recycling plant and get the metals out of there and then build new ones. And because unlike petroleum, unlike crude oil or natural gas, lithium and copper and nickel and cobalt, et cetera, can be reused. Lithium doesn't lose its ability to hold a charge just because it's been in a battery for 30 years. So that's a huge plus, right? I think, that's obviously a great boon for the energy transition. The problem, though, is when we just look at the sheer demand rise for all these electronics, we know that we're going to need a lot more what are called virgin metals. That means metals taken out of new mines in the next 20, 30, 40 years. And before we get to that point where we can reach that truly circular economy. And the estimates as when we're going to get there are sort of all over the map. Some people say 2050. Some people argue it'll be later in the century. I don't think anyone, if they tell you a specific date, I don't think they can do that with any degree of certainty. What we do know, though, is we're going to need a lot of mines for the foreseeable future, and recycling technologies have to continuously improve. And so I chronicle the history of two recycling companies in the book. J.B. Straubel's Redwood. J.B. Straubel was an early executive at Tesla and left to found this recycling company. And then Ajay Kachar's Life Cycle, which is based in Toronto, and came out of his work at Hatch, an engineering firm. And it was important to contrast the different approaches to recycling there, but also bring to the reader in The War Below the complexities of recycling. I mean, just think about this. I mean, what is a battery? It's something that's charged. By definition, it's got a charge to it. And so if you're transporting a lot of batteries over a long distance to a recycling plant, you can sort of see the potential there for explosions or other fires or other type of nasty consequences. And indeed, one such explosion happened that I chronicle in The War Below, and that it definitely spooked people, I think is the right term, because this was going from Georgia all the way to a recycling plant in Los Angeles. So basically across much of the width of the United States. And so transportation is actually the number one cost in recycling right now, not this expensive recycling facility, not any of the other parts right now. So in order to truly go circular or even get closer to that, we're going to need to have a lot more recycling plants. And a recycling plant is big. It's in a big warehouse. It can be, it's an industrial activity. And so there's a lot of choices to be made there as well. It's like, do we want more of these industrial type facilities really around the country and really around the world? And at some point, we're going to have a lot more of these in order to get these building blocks that we need. And that's another conversation, another choice that we're not having right now. And so I really wanted folks to think through that. Also, just to get more comfortable with the idea of recycling in general. I mean, we've all seen the ads when we were kids about reduce, reuse, recycle. And I think people are used to that for things like cardboard, for instance, when you finish with a cereal box. But we all have a drawer filled with old cell phones and wires. I know I have one. I have no doubt the three of you do as well. And those obviously contain critical minerals that could be recycled and reused and put into new devices in the future. So incentivizing consumers to actually do that is one of the things that I explore in The War Below. And an analog that I draw is the lead acid battery recycling infrastructure. So these are the batteries that are used in internal combustion engines. They're very, very common. They're ubiquitous. And you probably don't even realize this if you own an internal combustion engine vehicle, but when you have a battery that's end of life, you turn it in, you buy a new one, and there's about a $2 or $3 charge on the new one that actually does not go to the manufacturer. It goes to fund this entire recycling ecosystem for lead acid batteries that is just so common nowadays that that lead acid battery is torn apart and the parts are used to make new lead acid batteries that go into new batteries for new internal combustion engines. There's this whole industry that folks have not actually realized exists. And that's probably for the best. It just hums in the background. And so what I'm curious about is as the electric vehicle transition accelerates, will we sort of have that baked in where you're just sort of used to paying an X dollar surcharge on your battery when you get a car, an electric vehicle, and then that helps fund this entire ecosystem. There's some hiccups along the way there. I mean, battery chemistries are different depending on your needs. Certain manufacturers like BMW prefer certain battery chemistries that, say, a Ford might not prefer. And so how would that come into play in recycling? I mean, these are the things that companies like Redwood and Lifecycle are exploring and thinking through that I talk about in the book. And I think those kinks will be ironed out in time, but having an ecosystem that is just encouraging the consumer to think through just returning that, expecting a charge to be there, and it'll help fund this broader ecosystem, I think is perhaps where things are going slowly.
I think that's a very, very interesting point. I loved reading that chapter, especially on the recycling bit, because there is a company in India there's an EV company that is trying to do just that. But the modus operandi is what they are trying to do is they're trying to create an infrastructure where there are battery swaps, right? So the
Yeah.
so the consumers batteries are again deposited with the company, and as and when the battery starts deteriorating in its efficiency, the company has the capability to reduce it, to recycle it at the very back end. So that's a pretty interesting case because I was reading and I was like, oh, that's a that's a cool point.
Nice.
Ernest, I just wanted to circle back on the point that we were discussing a bit earlier in one of the podcasts. So I read the book and I was so interested that I started consuming the podcast as well. So in one of the podcasts you said that there are different Washington departments that are speaking a different language or addressing mining very, very differently. And like
Yeah.
how Christian was mentioning that there was a Bureau of Mines earlier, and considering the challenge, because the challenge is apparent, right? The stakeholders are feeling the challenges on day-to-day basis. Is there an effort from the government side, from the business ecosystem, to actually try and integrate these department functions into one? Did you come across any of it in your discussions?
Well, I would say right now, and talking to not only industry, but local economic developers, as well as conservationists and environmentalists that might oppose certain mines, from their perspective, there is not an effort to integrate or not to speak with one voice. And one of the core stories that I talk about in the book, for instance, is the story of the Rhyolite Ridge lithium project in Nevada, about 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And this is a massive lithium deposit that would, if developed, be a massive supplier for Ford and other automakers. And it's obviously domestically in the United States, so you can see the big appeal. It's in the middle of nowhere, so you're not encroaching on anyone's. But the tension point comes because this rare flower found nowhere else in the planet lives on top of that lithium deposit. And so the tension point from the beginning is, can this flower coexist with this lithium mine? And I chronicle in The War Below the journey by a conservation group to push the Fish and Wildlife Service to declare this flower endangered. Well, at the same time, you've got the company applying for and receiving a Department of Energy conditional loan for more than $700 million to develop this project. And so therein lies the tension that I explore in the book is, can you have a mine developed right where a flower has been declared endangered? You have an endangered species there. The company is saying yes, that it can, and the Department of Energy is very confident that it can, otherwise it wouldn't have given this conditional loan. And so when I explore this in the book, okay, who ultimately is the arbiter here? I mean, obviously it's whoever sits in Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the ultimate arbiter there. But, you've got different approaches by different departments. that have different goals, right? So if you're the Department of Energy, your main goal is to help expand and prod the development of a domestic supply chain through the use of loans and other financial funds. If you are the Fish and Wildlife Service, you're there to protect endangered species and do other ecologically focused activities. And so I'm not necessarily saying that those ideas are at odds. I think they can be in harmony sometimes. But when one arm of the government is doing something that is seemingly at odds with another arm of the government, it does cause you to scratch your head and kind of wondering, okay, what are the behind the scenes conversations? And I do talk about that a little bit in the book. And then what are the remedies for that? And can sort of these sort of on the surface glaring inconsistencies be ironed out? And so I found this just time and time again when I was reporting out the book, is like, you don't seem to have a whole of government approach. And again, I know I used that phrase earlier, but it just, to me, it just sort of encapsulates the need for a more cohesive approach to a lot of these issues, because we as a society did not have the collective discussion 100, 150 years ago when the petroleum-based economy was taking off about what are the choices we're willing to make and what do we favor or not favor. And we're not really having it now as this new energy transition accelerates. And that's bad for consumers. And it's also bad coming from our government. We need the US government, or any government really, they need to be speaking with sort of one voice around what are the choices that we're willing to make. And they're willing as policymakers to either stomach or not stomach.
So when you're talking about the recycling plants and nearshoring or bringing them closer to port, and I think of these synergies that we could have here. So we do have, the federal government subsidizing or buying up large EV freight vehicles, and some companies also doing this. But there are possible synergies and benefits here in that if we bring a recycling plant for batteries closer to our ports, so let's say Houston, LA, maybe Duluth, Minnesota for the Midwest or somewhere there, and then in New York and somewhere down along elsewhere in the Gulf Coast or in the Carolinas, we can reduce our shipping costs. And I think that is a large cost across industries. And when you look at mining companies, the same when we do our project evaluations, transportation makes up the bulk of the cost. And
Right.
so maybe we can reduce the freight costs, reduce the emissions from ICE vehicles if we can replace them with EV freight. So it's less risky if there is something that happens, God forbid. And it just seems like it makes sense. So I just wanted to throw that comment in there. So
Yeah, I mean, the main recycling company I profile in The War Below, Li-Cycle, has this, what they call a hub and spoke model. And so Christian actually have created this network of recycling collection facilities. I believe they have at least 4 now. Phoenix, I'm going to get all the cities wrong off the top of my head. Phoenix, Alabama, Toronto, gosh, there's about 4 or 5, and the way that they have strategically set it up is to evoke an airline. Airlines have hub and spoke models, and you have sort of like a centralized hub, and then you might have sort of feeder airport locations. So if you're transferring from Topeka to, say, London, you would fly Topeka to, say, Denver, and then Denver to London. But this is a way where you would take your old battery and maybe you might send it into a collection facility in Alabama. It'd be broken down into black mass, which is basically a shredded battery part. And then that would be sent to a centralized recycling facility, one per continent, where you would then take apart that black mass would be broken down into the component metals. And so the goal of the company is to do that. And I chronicle how they got to that strategy and how they sort of see that in the book. Part of the reason they're in places like Alabama, which might not necessarily seem like a place you'd be off the top of your head, is because there's a lot of EV manufacturing there. Mercedes is a big plant. And right now, the biggest contributor to the recycling supply chain is basically scrap for making EV batteries, because there's just not enough EV batteries en masse out there right now to actually power this whole supply chain. And so you basically take scrap that comes off of the EV production line, and you can then recycle that. And having a big plant there, obviously you have a lot of scrap. So that makes logistical sense. But the economics of recycling are vastly different than the economics of mining. And so it's going to require some interesting transitions in the next few years.
big ideas for punchy people. So.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So this was our conversation with Mr. Ernest Scheyder. We really hope you enjoyed it. It has been our consistent effort for the past 2 to 3 episodes to bring you a a very diverse perspective of on rare earths and the supply chain and the industries that it's impacting. We really hope that you are finding amazing tangents to delve deeper into. And don't forget to grab Mr. Scheider's book, The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, and have an amazing read. To plug another event, we have our nuclear energy policy and uranium mining event scheduled for the February of 22nd, and it's going to start at 12:30 p.m. We have an amazing panel of experts waiting for you. So hope to see you there, and don't forget to register. Thank you so much.